the comments were great. The questions were phenomenal. I sat there thinking in particular about the question about the relationship of just war to natural law, and I was thinking, I just want to scrap my text and respond to that question. Actually, I will begin by responding to that, because I want to sort of step back for a second and just simplify what we're up to. One of the things that you'll see, and you even heard it when the three before me were speaking, is that all of us are trained in a very similar tradition. The convergence of Catholic theology and Protestant theology in the Anglo-American world has been ongoing for decades. And Nigel, Mark, Dan, and I all work in a tradition that is drawing on each other all the time and drawing profitably on each other all the time. And so Ramsey is as important to me as it is to them. And he was a Methodist theologian. I actually studied at a Methodist seminary before I went to my Catholic education. As a Catholic, I studied there. So Ramsey's, obviously a kind of influence for me. Oliver O'Donovan's work, who was also influenced by Ramsey, is an influence for me as well. But the just war thing, we reify it too much. We speak about it as though it's some sort of apparatus. It's not an apparatus. It is, and this would be my claim in response to the question of its relationship to the natural law. The natural law, too, can be thought of as a kind of weird apparatus. It's really just practical reasoning. When Catholics talk about the natural law, what they're talking about is practical reasoning. And it's something that we all engage in. And it's built into who we are as human beings, as these creatures of God gifted with intelligence, right? So when we understand the sort of first principle of natural law, which is to do the good and avoid evil, we're just describing what human beings do. And in a way, we're, as Ulpian and others pointed out, we're kind of describing what animals do. They identify certain kinds of goods and they pursue them. There's a rabbit. I'm a fox, right? What do? I chase the fox. I'm a fox. There's a bear. What do? I flee, right? And human beings, it's more or less the same thing. So remind yourself as we're talking about just war theory and the just war account and so on, that really what we're just talking about is how to understand certain kinds of moral activity, right? What should I do now? Who makes the judgment about what we should do right now, right? And that's all the just war theory is really doing. Over time, it's kind of built up into a kind of apparatus for thinking through certain kinds of fundamental questions about what is the moral thing to do right now. So, all right. So let's get Catholic for a few moments, all right? Nigel mentioned some of the figures in the tradition. I'm going to focus on Robert Bellarmine, who Nigel did not mention. And Robert Bellarmine was a theologian roughly around the time, a little bit after Luther, and also therefore after Francisco de Vitoria. And I'm also going to begin us, though, with the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Luther had a shorter catechism, right? The Catholics, we produce catechisms every once in a while. And it's, ours is not a short or anything. It's about this thick, and it goes through a series of questions. And I'm going to start us right in the middle of it. So it begins its discussion of killing by pointing to the fifth commandment's prohibition, of killing. Exodus 20:13 tells Jews and Christians, you shall not kill. The prohibition, the Catechism points out, finds specification later in Scripture, right? So that's Exodus 20:13. In Exodus 23:7, the deliberate murder of an innocent person is gravely contrary, is a wrong, is contrary to the dignity of the human being, to the golden rule, ultimately to the holiness of the Creator. This is the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 2261. So if you want to Google that or look it up, if you have the book, you can see right there. Thou shalt not kill, it's actually specified. We're speaking in terms of you should not take innocent life. Taking an innocent life is in fact prohibited. So already what you see is a kind of specification of moral action. What can or can't we do? We can never take innocent life. Innocence and guilt are components of the commandment's prohibition. So therefore, the Catholic tradition asserts, right, deliberate killing of the innocent is understood as a malum in se, right? We use Latin a lot in Catholicism, right? It's a malum in se. It's an evil in and of itself. It cannot be made right, okay? Nothing can justify the deliberate or intentional taking of innocent human life. What Scripture prohibits then is the intentional killing of human beings. But legitimate defense can be permitted. The Catechism says immediately after this, respect for human life enjoined by the commandment is, or has been so far, only negative. Never take innocent life. Do not attack the innocent. But that legitimate defense begins to fill out the requirements of the commandment beyond the prohibition. So the prohibition is not telling us merely what not to do. It's also enjoining certain kinds of behavior from us positively. The Catechism, therefore, connects this prohibition to love. There was a great question. How does this relate to charity? The Catechism makes the connection. On its own, an act respecting a prohibition may or may not be moved by love. That was Nigel's point about the intentionality of action, helping us understand what kind of act we're dealing with. The commandment is brought to perfection, Pope John Paul II says, when it culminates in the positive commandment which obliges us to be responsible for our neighbor as for ourselves. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, he said, John Paul II says. So the prohibition on killing innocent life carries with it the injunction to care for those who are threatened by others. Have you ever, you're all Twitter and social media people, you're young, right? You're hip, you have your phones, right? You ever seen these awful, awful videos that become viral of people beating up other people, right? I'm sure you've all seen them, right? In essence, a Christian has to ask him or herself, am I the kind of person who would sit there, right, and videotape somebody being beaten by somebody else? I mean, aside from taking joy in it, right, which some people apparently do, right, or would I intervene? Right, would I intervene to try to stop that? Maybe put my phone down, for instance, right, horror, right, and, intervene to try to stop this beatdown. And what this is saying is that's exactly what a Christian ought to do. Paul Ramsey, who we've referred to, right, refers to, as everybody who studies him knows, the instance of the Good Samaritan, and he kind of wonders, well, what would Jesus have done if Jesus had come on the beating, right? And we get to all see that all the time, right, in social media. Hopefully we'd be the kind of people who would intervene. So love requires more than that we not murder. It requires love of self and neighbor to the point of becoming responsible for their well-being, right? Trying to help them. So, contrary to some views influenced by contemporary pacifist thinking, the killing that occurs in the legitimate defense of persons and societies is not an exception to the prohibition against murder of the innocent that constitutes intentional killing. Okay? So, contrary to those who would have us think otherwise, the killing that occurs in legitimate defense of persons and societies is not an exception to the prohibition against the murder of the innocent that constitutes intentional killing. That is the Catechism, number 2263. The killing that occurs in legitimate defense is a different kind of act. In the killing of the aggressor in a situation of self-defense, the intention of the act is ordered towards my defense, right? The defense of the victim. Killing in self-defense, therefore, requires no special authorization of those responsible for the community, nor need it entail an inordinate self-love. Instead, killing in self-defense, the Catechism continues, can express the appropriate regard of self to which we are called by Christ. Or you could even say, to which we are called by nature, right? By nature, we defend ourselves. By what we would call like the natural law. We defend ourselves. So love towards oneself is a fundamental principle of morality. Therefore, it is legitimate to insist on respect for one's own right to life. Someone who defends his life is not guilty of murder, even if he is forced to deal his aggressor a lethal blow. Number 2264 of the Catechism. I'm going to skip a little bit right now. So the Catechism at this point points to Thomas Aquinas. And some of you are familiar with Thomas Aquinas. He's got this enormous text, the Summa Theologiae, right? And in the second part of the second part, he defends the principle, or he defends self-defense along these lines as the Catechism has been describing. In there, he speaks of a kind of double effect, and maybe you guys have heard some of this language before. But this is, again, just act analysis. What we're doing is just trying to analyze certain kinds of acts. What am I doing right now when I choose to kill someone? And there he explains, Aquinas explains, any act that one does can have more than one effect. We know this from the way we live our lives. I give a student a bad grade, right? And what it does, of course, is it damages his or her GPA, and it causes him or her perhaps some distress, maybe even to cry, right? I didn't intend, right, to make the student cry. I might have known the student's going to cry when he or she gets the bad grade, but nobody would say Capizzi made the student cry, right, by giving the bad grade, right? My act has two effects. One, I intend, right, the apt evaluation of the student's paper or something. The other one, I don't intend, even though, again, I can foresee it, right? I might even say, please don't cry, right? Like, I know you're going to cry when you see the grade, but please don't cry. But nobody would say, I intend. So that's all Thomas is saying, right, at this point. Some acts have two effects. One, we're responsible for, right? Now, if I wanted to make the student cry, right? Right? I mean, I could do that, right? And you might say, Capizzi, you're claiming you didn't want to make her cry, but you do, right? I can see how the way you kind of jazzed it up, you kind of handed it in front of everybody, look what Susan's getting, right? Right? You were trying to humiliate her. Somebody could definitely push back, right? But the important thing here is, right, they can have multiple effects. And that's what he says is the case in a situation of legitimate defense. And the whole apparatus of moral analysis is try to figure out what, in fact, do you intend here, right? What are you trying to do? So if somebody comes up to me and hurls an insult at me and I pull a gun out and shoot him and say, look, I'm defending myself against them, right? People would say, I don't know, right? I mean, it seems like you wanted to take him out, right? And you were using this as a rationalization for using a weapon to do so, right? I mean, you would rightly push back on that. But most situations of self-defense are not like that. Just war theory just sort of carries that kind of analysis into itself. When Aquinas talks about this, he's giving us, and even presupposing, the same kind of analysis that you see already earlier in the tradition. So he explains that the judicious use of force that is necessary in a situation of duress to preserve a genuine good, like my life, that is okay. The good of existence and derivative good of bodily integrity are legitimate goods. But those goods can only be preserved in manners proportionate to them, right? Christians, we recognize life is a great good, but it's not the greatest. There are goods that are greater even than our own physical lives, right? Those goods, right, help us understand the proportionality that is appropriate to using certain kinds of means in order to defend our lives. So, skipping ahead. The consistent teaching of the Church on self-defense recognizes it as a right that derives from love, right? A kind of apt love of self. In fact, a love of self that, right, relates to our love of God. Because we are to love ourselves as part of God's creation, we value our lives. The justice we owe God as created beings of a certain kind sets limits on that love. Indeed, as individuals, like I said, we can recognize goods that are higher than our own self-preservation, like the goods of other human beings, the goods of life and community, and also the good of religion itself. We may therefore allow our lives to be sacrificed for those goods. The justice that we owe to God may, in some cases, demand that we sacrifice our lives for those other goods. So while there is a right to legitimate defense of self, we can recognize superior obligations, limiting our recourse to that right. All that means is it's reasonable sometimes when people say, I'm not going to defend myself here, right? I choose to die in this situation in order to preserve some goods that we recognize as superior to the good even of my mortal existence. That is not true, however, for those who are in governing authority. As the Catechism says in the very next paragraph of the ones we've been looking at, this is 2265 now, legitimate defense can be not only a right but a grave duty for one who is responsible for the lives of others. Okay? The situation now changes. When I'm thinking about my own life, for which I am responsible, I can actually say, right now I'm going to sacrifice it for something else. But when public authority faces a threat to it, it has an obligation in certain circumstances to defend itself. The defense of the common good requires that an unjust aggressor be rendered unable to cause harm. For this reason, those who legitimately hold authority have the right to use arms to repel aggressors against the civil community entrusted to their responsibility. Okay? Makes sense? Everybody understand that? For those in governing authority, the use of force is more than a permission. It is responsible for the care of the community it serves, and that responsibility produces the duty to exercise loving concern even to the point of using force on its behalf. In this passage, we see the close connection of the justification of the use of force used in war to the justification for the use of force that is employed in domestic situations, or in other words, state affairs. Governing authority is responsible for the care of a civil community, right? Its care usually requires internal maintenance, the policing and the judging associated with the uses of force in domestic governance. That care, however, built upon principles associated with judgment and punishment, extends outwards when the community faces aggressors against the civil community. So the very next paragraph of the Catechism says, the efforts of the state to curb the spread of behavior harmful to people's rights and to the basic rules of civil society correspond to the requirement of safeguarding the common good. Legitimate public authority has the right and duty to inflict punishment proportionate to the gravity of the offense. 2266. The logic of Catechism's discussion of war arises within, is in the logic of defense of the community by those in authority. In other words, the logic of punishment. And this is very important. For the Catholic historical tradition of thinking about the logic of just war, the framework it's placed in is in the logic of punishment. Okay? Judgment and punishment. And just as we're so familiar with it and we just accept it as a kind of part of life in a domestic community, right, in the United States, right, the government has responsibility for judging and punishing crimes against the common good, against the people, right? So too does that same government have the responsibility for judging and punishing those who threaten it from outside. Okay? That's how this tradition has understood this. I'm going to try to look very quickly at some Bellarmine to make this point. I choose Bellarmine in part because nobody ever has heard of him, and certainly outside of Catholicism, people have not heard of him. He was a Counter-Reformation theologian, but you can see in him how stable the tradition of thinking is, right? So he's a good instance just for showing this is a kind of stable way of thinking about these problems within the Christian tradition. And even when Grotius, who's not much later than him, picks this stuff up, he's picking up elements that are all sort of circulating within the same place. And I do think ultimately really they are connected to natural law type claims, but that's perhaps something that we should argue. So he places it immediately in the context of punishment too. A Christian magistrate may use the sword, the gladio, right, the Latin, on those who disturb public peace. The defense of capital punishment by Christian theologians like Bellarmine was very common, a total commonplace. He draws on scripture and theology, theological precedent to defend capital punishment or just punishment in general, right? And he points out that this killing is not contrary or exceptional to the commandment not to kill. Instead, punishment by death is a different kind of act again. He quotes St. Jerome in his commentary on Jeremiah 22. To punish murderers and impious men is not shedding blood, St. Jerome says, but applying law. Okay, you can disagree with him, right? But it's just important to note that they're describing it as a different kind of act. It's not a violation of the prohibition against murder. He confirms his appeal by appealing to Augustine, Again, to the point that punishing criminals does not violate this precept of the fifth commandment. So, continuing the logic of killing as a form of punishment, he argues Scripture and tradition prohibit retaliation. Remember Nigel spoke about, or Professor Bigger spoke about, how vengeance is prohibited. Same idea. Retaliation is prohibited. This is Bellarmine writing. When Christ said, "Do not resist evil," he did not prohibit legitimate defense, but retaliation. Vengeance is prohibited, not just offense in punishment and war. So when he turns in the chapter 14 of his work on this question and asks himself whether war is permissible for Christians, he does so on the condition that war continues to serve the judgment characteristic of government. War cannot pursue vengeance or retaliation. War, he says, this is a direct quote, pertains to public justice, not to private vengeance, and just as love of enemies, which binds everyone, neither impedes the judge nor the executioner from their offices, nor does it impede soldiers or emperors from theirs. Okay? So again, about the question of somebody asked about the relationship of this all to charity or to love, he says this is consistent with it. Right? This is consistent with charity or love. This is it's a specification of the call to love the neighbor. Vengeance, therefore, is incompatible with charity. War, on the other hand, so long as it is not vengeful, is not incompatible, is compatible with charity. So, from a Catholic perspective, and indeed from the perspective of secular international law, the presupposition of war involves the absence of a common tribunal or political authority that can adjudicate disputes among nations or states. Right? Think about the domestic situation in the United States. The government has jurisdiction to judge right and wrong because, as the international lawyers and students of international law would say, the nation-state system is anarchic, meaning there's no authority above it. Well, it's actually contentious anyway. But there is no judge, right? There's no judge. Then war becomes necessary as a means of adjudicating certain kinds of claims. If, however, we could have some overarching authority that could make this judgment, it would make war obsolete. Right? That's more or less the argument. It would not make judging and punishing obsolete. It would make war, this specific kind of judging and punishing, obsolete. So, were that authority in place, it could make a judgment on the wrong necessary to war, the just cause, and levy the appropriate punishment. The absence of that authority capable of making the judgment is a necessary condition of war. In the past, Bellarmine explains, there were many authorities that were not subject to others in temporal matters that could therefore authorize war. We live in a nation-state system. Bellarmine did not, right? It was just emerging. And so he lists the kings, the Republic of Venice, princes, duchies, similar entities, all who could make certain kinds of authorizations for war. A plurality of political types existed then that are not present any longer. The point is there was no state monopoly on the use of force. Dukes and counts and princes and so on could authorize war, and in the case of a defensive war, anyone could. Bellarmine can insist for self-defense is lawful for anybody, not only a prince. So I'm going to skip a little bit and maybe just summarize the end, because I've talked a lot, and I think there's a lot on the table from the prior conversation that I agree with and that I disagree with. The Catholic claim is a jurisdictional claim, ultimately, right? Again, like, and you could see how I'm talking about the domestic situation and the international situation. And you find in Catholic documents appeals that say, because we are all created by God, all human beings, we are all subject to the same sorts of laws. And those same laws will allow us to make judgments that are right or wrong. One of the most important things in terms of thinking about whether I ought to do this, right? I ought to I ought to bring punishment on someone is my right judgment, right, or the right judgment of those who are in political authority, that a wrong has been committed. Not merely a wrong, right, but a certain kind of grave wrong, right, has in fact been committed. So somebody asked a really good question towards the end of the last session about, competing claims. Every country thinks its war is authorized, right? Every country thinks that it's more or less in the right. And the presupposition of the Catholic account, I think it's not merely the Catholic account, is, well, that kind of claim has to be susceptible to reason, right? And if it's susceptible to reason, we can actually make a kind of judgment as to who is more right here. The world is fallen, right? It's flawed. There's always going to be reasonable, if not right, claims, plausible claims here, but one in fact will be right. This is the whole basis of international law. It was the basis of what Bellarmine and Vittoria and Grotius appealed to, the jus gentium, right, the law of nations at that point. And because those claims, therefore, are susceptible of reason, we can actually determine who's in the right. So one country will be more right than the other, right? One claim will be more right than the other, and that is the claim of justice, right? That is the one that bears the right with it. Because the different claims are plausible, most soldiers find themselves in situations, right, where they're kind of advancing a cause, number one, that they don't really know all that much about. Number two, patriotically, they're thrown in with their place. This is why the laws insist on respecting the rights of soldiers as human beings, even in the context of war. This is supposed to be an act of loving, right? An act that is consistent with love. We also claim as Catholics that there ought to be, this is the more contentious claim, especially among certain kinds of Christian realists, there ought to be a kind of world political authority, right, whose job it is to help judge this. Now, you can think about world political authority in a kind of evil, nasty way, right, like Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or Peter Thiel or whomever, right, like some sort of tech giant, right, who has, the means and so on, right, to pull strings. Or you can think of it like I do, which is more or less like it's international law, right? That's what international law is aspiring to do, right? It's aspiring to be a kind of juridical framework for thinking about and helping adjudicate these kinds of really plausible competing claims, so we can say, no, China is in the wrong here, or China's in the right here with regard to Taiwan, or Britain's in the right, or Argentina's in the right with regard to the Falklands or whatever, right? Like, so that's the aspiration from a Catholic perspective. I think that's typically where the sort of Protestant realist types jump off the train a little bit, in terms of certain kinds of, national postures. But besides that, we really are, we share an approach to these questions that is rooted in fundamental theological claims. We are all created by God. Dan spoke about the way the world is, right, a couple of times. Like, realists begin with the way the world is. And a component of that, of course, for Christians is, it's redeemed, right, saved and redeemed by Christ. And the victory is assured by Christ, right? So whatever we're doing right now isn't going to change that. And that also informs our analysis. Again, meaning there are certain kinds of goods we might have to sacrifice in order to be faithful to those, to that givenness of the world, in fact, as it is. I'll stop there, but thank you very much. Is that a question? Is there a mic for the questions again, or no? Okay, there you go. There's a mic coming out. You're not the UVA. You're not the Dallas guy. Do you know my daughter? I think it's Gabby, right? Gabriella. Not Gabby. Gabriella or Gabs, okay? Yeah. I know. I'm correcting you. There's a right and there's a wrong. Yeah. If you don't want to come up, I'll just repeat it.
My question for you is related to the teachings of Bellarmine and Augustine on capital punishment.
Right.
Where do the statements made by Pope
cute. So the question is about capital punishment, which I show that the tradition. I don't quite show it, right? But I give you an instance that the tradition views capital punishment as acceptable, right? And as some of you may know, Pope Francis has continued the line of modern popes that began with John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae and extended through Pope Benedict, where they're making a claim that ranges from something like capital punishment is no longer necessary or perhaps even apt as a retributive punishment in the modern world, which I think is the case for John Paul II, or to Francis, where there's a more perhaps doctrinal type claim that because of our understanding of human dignity, capital punishment is illicit. So if you read it more the former way, like what I think was happening with John Paul II and perhaps Benedict, you'd say, okay, there's not quite a doctrinal change here. There's a doctrinal recognition that's rooted again in Augustine saying to his friends. His friends are writing him letters. His friends happen to be governors. Hey, I've got this situation. What do you think? And Augustine always writes, well, look, it's certainly within your right as a leader, right, as a governor. You have the jurisdiction to punish in this way, and it's not illicit, right? However, you're a Christian. Extend mercy, right? And that recognition of the right of the state to punish, that in fact the punishment by even death can be an apt form of punishment, becomes, right, a kind of thing that's carried forward within the tradition. Look, the Pope, who is, for us, morally authoritative, is challenging that older tradition, and I think it's a welcome challenge to its internal consistency, to the relationship of mercy and justice. Ought we in fact expect the state not merely to be just but also be merciful to issues of time in a way? Time is an important element of punishment and so on. And this is a point Oliver O'Donovan makes beautifully in an essay where he writes in response to Evangelium Vitae at the time. And so it's a real challenge, and I think we're not clear where it's going to end. Well, it looks like it's pretty clear where it's going, and whether we're going to see whether we're going to name it as a kind of doctrinal development in the way D.H. or Dignitatis Humanae says we are developing the doctrine on religious liberty. It's leaning that way, right? Anyway, that's a long answer. Other questions, please? Yeah, again, you can stay put, whatever.
Hi, I'm Jenna from Liberty University. What is the distinction between punishment or justice and vengeance? Is it more than intention?
Right. Look, that's a great question. Okay, really, it's a great question because everything that I said and Nigel said and probably Mark and Dan agree with presupposes that somehow we can say that when we're punishing somebody, right, we're not acting out of vengeance, right? And vengeance seems to suggest, put differently, an easy way out, and it's a way that's suggested by Augustine in part, is to think of vengeance as a kind of emotion, right? I am trying to get back at somebody for something, and it's animated by hatred. So Augustine kind of lumps these things all together. And the tradition says, well, it's clear Augustine is saying we should not be animated by certain kinds of emotions as we pursue justice. I'm calling that, so if it's merely that, okay, then you just try to evacuate those emotions and say, look, what does justice require from me right here, right? What is the right thing to do in this situation as a form of punishment, or so on? And okay, then I do it, and I try again to make it it's business, it's not personal, right? As the Godfather says, right? This is business, it's not personal. But there's a chance that it's more than merely emotional, right? It's a chance that there's some other component of vengeance that we're being dismissive of, and I think that maybe that's partly what you're pointing to in the question. Because I know people who say, look, you can't distinguish retribution and retaliation the way you're trying, and if you think of retribution by etymology means like giving back, right? Like returning to somebody. You did X wrong, I'm giving you not X now or something. I'm trying to undo the thing that was done by you by just sort of handing back to you, right? Which is the lex talionis and so on, right? It's got to be proportionate, etc. And vengeance being more than that. You ever see the movie The Untouchables, right? There's this famous, that's the Chicago way, line where Sean Connery's character says, if they send one of yours to the hospital, you send one of theirs to the morgue, right? That's retaliation. Often we think of, right? I'm going to really get back at you, or I'm going to burn your house down, burn your village down, or whatever. So it would be some claim that justice is in fact animating this, and not that secondary thing. But I think it's more complicated, and so I think it's a great question. Yeah. And there was at least another one. Thank you. I'll get you next. Okay, in the back. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
So I'm Adriana from Patrick Henry College.
Hi, Adriana.
I was just wondering whether or not, in the context of total war, it's justified to kill civilians.
Total war?
Yes.
Well, I mean, if I say it's not justified to kill civilians, it's no longer total war, right? So this is the stuff that Lebecki and I and Strand, et cetera, argue about. If by kill civilians you mean to intentionally target civilians, the answer is no, it's not just. It's never just. If by that you mean to foresee, like I did, that the student's going to cry if I give him or her a bad grade, foresee that civilians will be killed, then yeah, I mean, then it can be justified, depending upon the circumstances and so on. The account, as I understand it, which again bases it in love, presupposes guilt and innocence as the distinction, right? So you can only bring certain kinds of harms and punishment of any sort against those who are guilty, right? And if you punish somebody who's innocent, intending to punish them for some other good, I want to tell everybody that it's wrong to do, certain kinds of things, and even though I know this guy didn't do it, I'm going to, meet the punishment out upon him. That's still wrong, right? So from the tradition as I understand it, and certainly the Catholic tradition is really clear on this, you cannot, I mean, that's the stuff I did at the beginning, you cannot intend to kill innocent people. Yes,
I think there's time for one more.
Okay, and that's the woman in the back, who's now moving towards the front. So she's no longer the woman in the back. It's paradox.
Thank you for your patience as I walked all the way up here.
Sure.
Dr. Capizzi, I was wondering if you or Bellarmine had any ideas about how a nation at war can protect its soldiers from the kind of moral injury we talked about earlier.
I don't. I mean, in a way, that's a better question for Mark to answer. It seemed as though Nigel was suggesting, and I think Mark was also suggesting as well, that part of it is to develop a culture that understands correctly the kinds of theological presuppositions, that we're talking about. That life is a great good, but not the greatest good. That even life in community, like a stable nation state and so on, is a great good, but not the greatest good. And that things can be done to preserve those goods, and sometimes even things that are, as Mark would say, horrible, right? Can be, killing another person, can be done for those great goods. Beyond that, it's hard. Nigel's point was really interesting, right, about how other cultures are more comfortable with killing, or certain kinds of victory over peoples, and it is a kind of consequence, arguably, of the Christianizing of our moral communities that we actually find it a problem in the first place. And things are in such disarray culturally, and have been for a long time. I don't think they're particularly much worse than they've been before, but they're in such disarray that clouds all of this kind of thinking. So, great question. I mean, I almost want to invite Mark, or Nigel to weigh in, but I think it's got to be. I mean, in a sense, what you're saying is kind of like, or I'm saying in response is, a kind of writing of these cultural mistakes and confusions about what cultures, what community is for, what life is for, and so on. It's hard. Yep.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.